So this is actually the first time I've been here, and it's not really, really hot. And getting to work with some spring veggies, but also wanted to show you guys a couple of techniques, including a biscuit technique. You know, when I write a recipe for the demo, one of the main things is everything that you can buy at the market, but also making it very simple for you guys to go home and feel inspired and do it again. So it's not too, I say, fancy of a recipe, but something pretty straightforward. A one-pot dish. Those are my personal favorites and what I like to cook at home, and what we also frequently will cook at work as well. So what we're doing today is we're doing a spring veggie potlikker. Does everybody know what a potlikker soup is? Okay. So potlikker is, and it's spelled with 2 Ks. It's the liquid from cooking down your greens. It's an old Southern thing. I guess sometimes people throw away their potlikker, which is silly, but it's very, very nutritious. So when you cook all those greens, collards, today we'll be using collards, some radish greens, turnips. You can also use mustard greens. The turnips, and I didn't see any baby turnips. I had some at work, so they're actually in the batch that you're going to be tasting. Use the little roots and also use the top. So we're using basically every part of everything that we're purchasing from the market today. So you'll also be getting a biscuit that will be in the bottom, because everybody loves a starchy, bready thing to soak up all that juice. Now, the one reason, I like to show you guys simple techniques to use at home that, they don't really teach in cookbooks. Kevin Gillespie's cookbook, this technique is in there, where instead of cutting in butter with a fork or using your fingers, we're using a cheese grater, and it makes it super, super easy. Yes? A cheese grater. And it makes the butter chunks a uniform size, and it keeps it nice and chilled because you're not handling it with your hands until you go to knead it out a little bit. So that's something I also hope y'all take home, and I'll tell y'all a couple of little tricks too along the way that, if you wanted to make a big batch of biscuits, there are certain stopping points where you don't have to do it day of. You can make them fully and throw them in the freezer not cooked, and get it to the point where we've grated the butter into the flour and coated it, and just throw that in the fridge and mix it when you're ready to throw them in the oven. So, all right. So to get started, and we'll get this cooking. These guys help, but sometimes the wind can be a little dangerous. So to start our potlikker, and I'm sure vegetarians would not want the pork, but that's part of potlikker. So when you're cooking your greens and you got a ham hock or something in there, we're using bacon ends and pieces, which you can get for cheaper than your sliced bacon, because we're cutting them up anyway, so we don't need fancy pieces. So we'll let this guy preheat a little bit. And what you can do after you get them all chopped up, relatively small dice. They don't need to be a super uniform size, because they're going to get simmered in afterwards, so they'll soften up a bit. We're going to render it down in a little bit of butter, but if you're someone who keeps all your bacon fat, pork fat, any kind of fat, you can use that too. We just want to add a little bit of extra fat in there because we want it in our potlikker to give it a little bit more body. We have, at work, we have a fat shelf in the freezer. We save bacon fat, of course, whenever we've got extra like raw pork fat, chicken fat, duck fat, beef fat. So, and that's another thing that we utilize on a regular basis too, is if we are pan searing chicken, or we're deep frying pork skins, we're using some of that fat in addition to maybe some oil. It's something that's not going in the trash right away. So this recipe calls for, and if you wanted to put more bacon in there, you certainly could. I'm actually not sure what quantity that bag was. I should have checked first. But I'm not going to start with the entire thing. Yeah, I didn't read what size the bag was though. Yeah, so anyway, we'll start rendering that down. And it doesn't need to be fully crispy. We just want to get some of that fat out so that when we go to sweat our onions and garlic, we've got some fat in there to coat it. And in goes a little bit of butter. All right, we'll get that going. I've lost my containers. Okay, so then, you could do this. A lot of times you see it, and certainly if we were doing it in the summer, we'd put field peas, black-eyed peas. You could do butter beans. But we're still sticking with spring veggies. So I've already cleaned one bunch of radishes, including the tops. They've been chopped up, stems and everything. They're really, really tender. I've also cleaned one bunch of baby collards. Has everybody here had baby collards before? No. Okay, I'm gonna pass these guys around. So, oh, hello. Okay, I won't. Nope. Did it go back? Is it good now? Okay. Now I won't talk as loud. Sorry. So these guys are super, super tender at this point. I think this soup cooked for yesterday a total of 30 minutes once all the greens were in, and then it's just been reheated. It's not like, those big giant collards you see at like DeKalb Farmers Market that you gotta cook those things if you want them to be tender. And these have been sitting in the sun a little bit, so they're a little wilty, but if y'all want to pass those around, and you can even use the stems too. So what I did is I actually de-stemmed them first and chopped those a little bit smaller because they'll take longer to cook, and then we've just got the chopped greens as well. Also one bunch of chopped kale. So you can, and the batch that y'all are going to taste also has mustard greens in it to spice it up a bit. But you can put in whatever you want. You could even, I tasted over at RJ's place, Planted Rock. Have y'all ever bought anything from him? He's got this arugula over there called wasabi arugula, and it is spicy. It is really spicy. So if you wanted to get some of that, you could put that in there as well. All right, so we're starting to get Planted Rock. Yeah, it's behind here. So we're starting to get a little bit of rendering, but I'm going to let it keep going. Our pot's finally nice and hot. Make sure on this you are using a heavy bottom pot because we're going to do quite a bit of rendering and sauteing instead of like an aluminum really thin bottom. That'll also just keep the heat nice and even. All right, so other items to go in here. We've got green garlic, which is just young garlic. It's really tasty. It's one of my favorite spring items to use. And then we're also going to just use spring onions. So some of the onions you'll see, like if they're like a sweet bulb variety, like a Vidalia, they'll be a little bit more bulbous at the end, but you can just, whatever you happen to grab is just fine. So we're going to just chop those guys up. For the green garlic, and you can save this if you're making a stock or a broth or something. If you just want to split it down the middle and then quarter it, and then all you got to do is slice it. And then the onions we're just going to chop, and that's it. We got a nice day today, didn't we? We kind of lucked out. It was chilly earlier, but y'all get warmed up with this soup. That is certain. Alrighty, so we got our garlic, and then these guys we're just going to go through and chop. Y'all have any questions so far? Very good. Like, where was I born? Up the street, actually, at Piedmont Hospital, or down the street. Yeah, I grew up in the Dunwoody Sandy Springs area. Yes. North Springs High School? Texas Culinary Academy in North Austin. It's now Le Cordon Bleu of Austin or something. Yeah. So went out to Austin, went to the University of Texas, and then went to culinary school. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so we're starting, our bacon is, it's starting to render out, but again, we're not looking for those, the crispy bacon, the little bacon bits. We just want to start getting some of that fat out. So we're going to go ahead and add our greens. Will you grab me one of those deli containers down there? Yeah, thank you. All right. So what are y'all's favorite spring veggies? Anybody have favorites? Beets? Leeks, asparagus. I saw somebody's got, I think actually RJ, he might be out by now though, has some, the asparagus that you'll see a farmer here growing is pretty different than what you see at the store. It tends to be a lot longer and doesn't quite have at least that they pick and sell, the really fibrous end. I mean, some of his asparagus is probably like this long, and you can use the whole thing. You don't have to peel it. You don't have to do anything. It's nice and tender. So one of the things that we're looking for, everybody, I'm pretty sure I've taught you guys this who've been here before, is we want that fond on the bottom of the pan. That's the good stuff. And we're eventually going to deglaze it if my pan gets hot enough. So if I were cooking this at home without all the wind, I'd probably take only a minute or two to sweat this out, but it's going to take a little bit longer. So, and then going in order of cook times, we sweat that out. Instead of adding the greens next and cooking those down, we're actually going to add our carrots because they're going to take longer to cook. So if we put those in before the greens, we don't have to worry about them not being finished, but we also don't have to worry about them being overcooked. So if you get baby turnips or even like these radishes will cook up a bit faster than the carrots, so we would put the carrots in first. These guys are a little smaller, I think, than the ones that I use, so I'm just doing a bias cut. And these guys too, I don't think I've ever peeled carrots that I've gotten from the farmer's market. It's not necessary. If you do peel it, sometimes they're a little dirtier, and you can scrub them with like a fingernail brush. But if you can't quite get it out and you want them to look pretty, you can peel them, but save those peels for a stock or a veggie broth. All right. So this guy actually we'll cut in half. So all of this stuff, maybe not the greens, all of this I would save for a stock in the shop. We like to not throw things away. All right, so we'll pretend these are a little more sweated out than they actually are. But even just putting in these greens, the onion and garlic, it's going to release a little bit of moisture. So we've already started to get some of that fond off of the bottom of the pan. Which, when we deglaze it with the whiskey, we will certainly get more of it off. But again, we're dealing with a little bit of a heat issue. So carrots are going. I'm going to let those just sit for a minute and see if we can get some more color before I actually deglaze them. We'll start dishing out the samples, and then I'm going to show y'all the biscuit technique. Now, obviously, I brought baked biscuits, so I'll just be mixing the dough and showing y'all about how much I handle it with my hands when we're kneading it. But again, it's pretty minimal. It's not quite a drop biscuit. Are y'all familiar with drop biscuits? Yeah. So it's a little more processed than that, but only in terms of folding it over, so it's got a little bit of a layer. Not quite like the Pillsbury stuff you get at the store that's like layers, If you wanted to fold it over enough times, you could get it to look a little bit more like that, like making a puff pastry dough. But anyway, still minimally processed. I personally love drop biscuits. All right. So on the recipe that y'all have, whenever we're making biscuits at the shop, we always go by weight instead of volume. But I did put conversions on there. If you don't have a small scale at home, you don't need to use one. Don't feel like you need to use one. It may adjust the amount of liquid. It may adjust the amount of buttermilk that you put in. But, to be honest, when I'm making biscuits, I don't know that I ever actually measure the buttermilk. The measurement on the recipe is meant for, that's about how much it should be. If you start with a little bit less and find that you need to add more, then just add more. It's a little bit more along the lines of feel. So, one of the key steps in making this is chilled butter. We keep it nice and chilled. You can throw it in the freezer. I've got it on ice right now. I'm about to pull it out. It's a lot easier to handle and put on the grater. I really think y'all like this technique. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out all my dry ingredients. I don't think I've ever baked anything at the market for you guys before. This is fun. And this is actually the ratios. I'm looking for my significant other. The ratios that we got out of culinary school. And the technique is something that was in an America's Test Kitchen, either show or magazine. That's about 4 cups. You can sift it if you want. It's up to you. This is why I'll bake biscuits, but something that needs to be more precise. Not really my forte. All right. So, again, all dry ingredients together, and that'll include the chives. By the way, just to note on that recipe, I did not put a full tablespoon of pepper in there. I probably did just half a tablespoon, so a teaspoon and a half. And still the full amount of salt, though, which is a good amount. 5 teaspoons, so we'll go a third. That's 5 teaspoons, right? 1 2/3. And then baking powder. Oh, sorry. There we go. Hopefully these will bake up okay. Y'all can fight over who wants to take the dough home.
Jen?
Yes.
Can you speak to the height you like to work? Sometimes your stance,
Yeah.
chopping.
Yeah. Y'all know this. Who knows this? By the way, so I know Seth Friedman very well. Y'all have been here when he's done a demo. So what I do, if it's something where I'm gonna have to lean over, that especially if you're doing it long periods of time, it doesn't feel good on your back. Our tables at work are higher, not quite counter height like you would have at home, but I don't know, maybe about here, which is great if you're having to do a lot of chopping. But if you're having to pick pin bones out of salmon or something, or even doing something that's a little bit finer, this is way better. And it is significantly easier. And you don't wake up a day later with your back going, what did I do? All right, so black pepper. We'll cut the chives. All I've done is just mixed it again, my dry ingredients. These carrots, these are taking a minute. They're still going. We'll do this full bunch of chives. Sorry, is that better? Y'all can see. Anyway, so Seth was actually in, he's at Peach Dish now. Are y'all familiar with, it's one of the meal kit companies. He, Avalon has had a working relationship with Seth for a long time, and he did a demo here a couple of years ago that was like, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks after mine, and apparently was doing the stance, and y'all just totally called him out on it. They're like, yeah, Jenn already taught us that. We were talking about that yesterday, so. All right, so chive's going into the dry, and now I'm going to pull out that butter. Now, you could certainly, so this is a 5-ounce piece. You know, if you wanted to save and not use this butter, you certainly could, as long as it's an unsalted butter, which this is, and it is nice and firm, so it's going to be perfect. So I'll do 1 plus a little bit. Will you hand me that spoon? Yeah. If you want to start. Yeah. No, that there aren't really any turnips at the market today, so that's fine. So at this point, my carrots have started to cook a bit, so I'll throw in the radishes, and then I'm going to immediately deglaze with some whiskey. So the first time I ever had anything potlikker or learned anything potlikker was at, by the way, I'm going to put the stems in too because they'll take a little bit longer to cook, was in Texas. I started working for Kent Rathman, Kevin's brother, and we would do like these wine dinners out of, it was a big, beautiful kitchen, way bigger than you see, like, certainly than you would see in New York, but even most of the kitchens here. It's a Texas-sized kitchen is exactly what it was. So we did this one wine dinner, and the dish was, I don't really remember. I think it was a carrot, or I'm sorry, potato puree or like candied sweet potatoes or something, greens, duck, something else. Obviously not that important, but I remember the potlikker because the chef there served the potlikker with a shot of whiskey, hence the whiskey. Yeah, so that was part of the dish, is that you you took the shot of whiskey, you chased it with the potlikker, you put the rest of the potlikker in the bottom of the bowl where the rest of the plate was, and then you ate it. That was my first exposure to potlikker, and so I'm going, is that like some kind of, like, that's what you make mixed drinks with? No. No. Potlikker was not something that I grew up with. They're not paying attention. All right. So one of the other things, you know, if you want to keep from getting your hands a little too messy on this, and I'm going to put a glove on my other hand also. So this butter is, I mean, this is almost a little bit more like European style. It doesn't have quite as much moisture content, so we may end up actually putting in more buttermilk than the recipe calls for. And if you had, like, for whatever reason, a surplus of one of their flavored butters, which I couldn't name off the top of my head, cinnamon, maybe not cinnamon. Do they have any herb butters? You could do the herb butter in it, or like a black pepper or something. All right, so that's about 7 ounces. If it is a little bit extra, it's fine. It's not going to hurt you. Can't have too much butter. No. Yes. All right. So I hope y'all take away with learning a couple of things today. And I don't know if I have any firepower on there anymore. Oh, it's gone. No, it's going. But you know, y'all have got stuff to taste, so I'm not worried about it. So the first thing I'll do, just so that it's not sticking, is I'm just going to coat the whole thing with butter or with flour, and then quite literally just grate it in. When we have to do like large amounts of biscuits at work, we have it's a ricer attachment for Hobart, which is basically a giant mixer, and you can actually chop the butter up a little bit smaller like this and put it in the freezer and just feed it through straight into your already measured dry ingredients, and it makes the process very fast. So once I'm grating it in, y'all, and gonna try to not blow flour. So I have one more to grate, but I'll just kind of very gently get it so it coats immediately and you don't get clumps. That keeping it nice and chilled will also keep it from getting clumped up. All right. And at this point, I'm not really going to use my hands anymore. I'm going to do it with my other spoon. It's right here. Okay, so this is the point where if you wanted to just get this ready, you know, you were entertaining either later that evening or the next day, you're prepping for Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever. You could take the biscuits to this point, just keep it in the bowl or put it in something smaller and throw it in your fridge. And then just the next day, mix in your buttermilk. Yeah, so when we have to make a lot of biscuits too, that's what we typically do. Yeah, because we don't, kind of depending on what else we have going on, we won't necessarily have the freezer space to make them a day ahead and put them in the freezer. So instead we'll do this, and then you just have to mix in the wet. All right, and then we got buttermilk. All right, yes. The fridge. So after after mixing the buttermilk and kneading it out and even cutting them, then you can put it in the freezer. It does have baking powder in it, which instead of baking soda is also activated with liquid. So if you are gonna go ahead and add your buttermilk, then you can put it in the freezer. Yeah, and it'll even go ahead and brush it with your butter, and all you do is pop it out, unwrap it, throw it in an oven. I do believe also did I put the baking times for baking it from frozen on there? Okay. Yeah. It makes it fairly easy. Okay, so this is a quart. Just out of curiosity, we'll actually measure this. Does anybody do buttermilk here? Yes. Okay. The butter people. Ah. Lauren got that from Whole Foods. So I've started bringing it together. That was about 13 ounces. This may take a little bit more because I wasn't super exact in my measuring of the flour, which is fine. It just means we may have to adjust the amount of liquid added. So right now it's still pretty crumbly. We don't want it to come together more than that, but not be wet. So at this point, I'm just going to do this number. It can also, when you're making this, the amount of liquid you add could depend on the exact flour that you use. It could depend on the moisture content of your butter. It could also depend on how humid it is outside, which can affect it. So it's still, some parts of it are gooey. I'm going to mix it a little bit more. So we're getting to the point where it's mostly coming together, but if you can see, there's still a little bit of loose flour down at the bottom. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more buttermilk. So we've probably ended up doing, I don't know, maybe 15 ounces on this batch. About. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the great things about drop biscuits, because on a drop biscuit at this point we would literally just, on a cookie sheet. It's a drop biscuit. Come on. Yeah, that's why they're called drop biscuits. Yeah, and so that's one of the reasons when I'm kneading it, all I'm doing instead of, I'll show y'all what we're gonna do to finish that. So instead of actually kneading it, all I'm doing is folding it to get a little bit of layer action, but that's it. and maybe to like make sure we've got even distribution of liquid versus not. I'll just use this as my floured surface. Yes.
I hardly ever reach for my baking powder, so I'm keeping it in the freezer.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that a good?
Yeah.
Is it good to keep longer?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll just do it a couple of times. Again, with the minimal amount of handling it with your hands, which are obviously more than room temp. Oh, look at this. Thank you. You know, it keeps the butter from getting warm and kind of melting into the rest of the dough. So at this point, all you would do is roll it out. So it's not a super wet dough, like it's not too sticky. And I also don't have any flour on there. So roll it out, you know, depending on how big you wanted your biscuits, 1/2 inch thick, maybe a little smaller, a little bit bigger, and brushed with melted butter. If you were to bake them right away into a hot oven, 425 until they're golden, might need to rotate them a couple of times if you've got hot spots in your oven. Or roll them out, cut them out, brush them with your butter, throw it in the freezer to pull later. And then the other thing is too, obviously this batch probably makes a bigger batch than you would need for your potlikker. So you could bake off half of it, freeze the rest. So pretty straightforward. Do y'all like that technique? Did anybody know that at all? No? All right. I did not invent it. I don't take credit. I love the technique. So, okay, we've got firepower back. I've already added the whiskey. At this point, yeah, I was gonna say, do we need to start passing? Nah, they're fine. Yeah, we can pass them. So at this point, all I'm gonna do is I'll throw in the collards first, and you know, I'll have trouble fitting everything in here until the greens actually wilt down. Collards first, then kale, and then your radish greens are gonna be the most tender, so I'd add those in last. If you've got turnip greens and mustard greens, those also tend to be very tender as well. So I'd put those in basically right before adding my stock. Once you do add the stock, and I'm gonna shift cutting boards again, just simmer it until, you know, it's done, until it's tender. And so anytime you're cooking greens, you know, some people add sugar, but in general you want a little bit of acid to it, especially to cut the fattiness of having all that pork in there. Obviously it's not quite tomato season. When I made this big batch at work, I did put a little bit of tomato juice that we had from last summer in there, only a little bit, but there are tomatoes at the market, they're just pickled. So that knocks out both our tomato component and our acid component. The batch that y'all are tasting has a couple of jars of these chopped up, plus a little bit of the pickling liquid. Not all of the pickling liquid, so you know you can use that for making vinaigrettes or whatever else you want to use it for. But it kind of helps round out the whole thing. We'll get you a special one. Okay. So, yeah. Again, still taking a little bit. So, you know, it's just another way of adding a little bit of acid to it. And these pickles they're called drunken tomatoes, but they're pickled. So it just kind of rounds everything out. Y'all like it? Yeah, very good. The other thing that I did not put on the recipe that I did add, just a little bit of crushed red pepper. When I was actually sweating out the bacon and the onions and garlic, just to add a little bit more heat to it. There are some mustard greens in there, but they're not super spicy, so we wanted a little bit more heat. Y'all have any questions? So y'all are gonna take this home and try it this week? Yeah. And then also this, and especially anytime you're doing like a soup or a stew, it's always better the next day. I mean, you can eat it right away, but if you make it and you're not eating it for the next, you know, immediately, it'll be just fine in the fridge. Or if you got extra, throw it in the freezer. That makes for a really quick dinner. That's how chefs eat, by the way. Don't do fancy stuff at home. All right, any other questions? Did I cover everything? Okay, good. Cool.